before. I lost that love before. I lost that love before.
Juniper,
What up?
what's up? How's it going?
It's going good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm just typical salty corporate old man. Wish it was Friday comment, but it's Thursday.
Well, I'm a salty mid-aged woman who also thinks it's almost Friday.
Yeah, nice.
Privilege of working a almost 9 to 5 Monday through Friday at a game store. So
That's a high roll. That's a high
It
roll
is.
for game store hours for sure.
yeah, I was unwilling to let go of that when I left corporate life. So I did whatever I could to hold on to it.
Strong negotiation tactics right there. That's good.
Yeah.
So we met playing Cube in Philly, but I kind of want to start off just knowing more about like your journey through Magic, and like I feel like no one ever starts with Cube, or it's like a really rare occurrence that you just come into Magic and learn Cube.
Yeah. More and
but-
more common though, I feel like now.
For
like,
sure.
kind of blowing up and having its, I guess, like second renaissance. I feel like there are more people who their like primary focus point of exposure is through Cube, which is cool. But yeah, definitely not the majority for sure.
Yeah. So when was the first boosty cracked?
The first boosty cracked was actually like 1998, maybe 90.
Solid.
Yeah, the first time I ever got exposed to Magic was Masks block, starting with Arcadian Masks.
Was that right
Yeah.
after 7th?
Wow, yeah, you're going after the like trivia.
Because
that I don't-
seventh was my
Yeah.
first set, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I think Odyssey block was after, so I think Masks might have been before.
Yeah, Odyssey was after Masks.
I
so-
think, yeah. I mean, we have the internet, but that's not fun.
do,
So
but-
that's not fun.
But yeah. And actually, technically, my first exposure to Magic wasn't by way of cracking a booster pack. Funny enough, it was at the time I was living in San Diego. My dad was in the military. I was on base a lot, and a kid who was also on base came up to me one day and just handed me like a big, like solid, like 7-inch stack of Magic cards. Like no. Like not even a rubber band around it, just like had a pile, put it into my hands and said, my parents won't let me have these anymore. And it was literally just a bunch of like Masks chaff and like a few rares.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until Prophecy that I started cracking booster packs. Cause for those, I mean, one, I was like 7. And so like, where was I getting booster pack money, you know?
For sure.
But yeah, I mean, my like first, and I think that part of why I've like really settled into Cube is because like my like earliest exposure to Magic was looking at this big pile of chaff of bulk and just like throwing stuff together that didn't make any sense with dog shit mana bases, and just like trying to make it happen and like playing games every once in a while when I could with like other kids on base who were also getting into Magic. But yeah, that was my first point of exposure. And I guess when it comes to like, I mean, I think that's like the real Magic, but like when we talk about like, I don't know, like formats and like more formalized play,
Mhm.
I mean, the cool thing is that like I've consistently played Magic that since 1998. I've never really taken a break, except for maybe
That's
a few months
impressive.
of time. It's impressive, but it's also odd. It's really what it is. I've just been highly fixated on this for like my entire life, and like nothing has been ever able to get me to shake it. But by the time I was like middle school age, that's when I started hitting up LGSs, and like actually starting to, go to F&Ms and, hit little tourneys when I could. And then from there, I kind of just slowly devolved into like a full blown like comp degen, to the point
Nice.
where I spent some time running around hitting the GP circuits.
So what era was that? Like, what was that like peak?
That was like, I think that like the peak of that was like 2007 to like 2000 and 13, I think, was
Okay.
kind of like the peak of that. And then like and the thing with like, while I've never really taken a break, like how invested both like energy wise as well as monetarily in the game I was, did kind of wax and wane, you know. So like after I took a break from grinding, I did have like a brief commander period, and then I was playing a lot of limited,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't until, I don't know, like at this point, like 3 maybe years ago, that I got like back into comp grinding. And before that, I was like doing like a lot of limited, a lot of pauper, like
Mm-hmm.
whether it was local or tournaments. Um, and I've always been like a huge vintage and legacy degen, whether in person or on Moto or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, about like 3-ish years ago, I got back on the comp grind, hitting RCQs, and I was just at the RC in DC, back in the
Nice.
fall. But I have officially announced my re-retirement from
All right.
comp grinding. I think I'm done. And at this point, like, I'm 31. Like, I don't know. I'm not really trying to devote. I like have a girlfriend and a job and a life, and so I'm not trying to like burn at my entire weekend just like grinding RCQs,
I hear
to
you.
like, you know just to like scrub out.
No, I hear you. As a this is 36-year-old with a girlfriend and a job and a dog. Like it's and I feel like for me, it's like I think it's true in everything, but like once you get really good at something or like get close to the flame, like what it takes to really be good. And that can be
Right.
like discouraging. Like you're like, fuck, like I know what it's going to take to be excellent at this. And I don't have like, it doesn't fit into my life to do what I know that I have to do to be like as good as I want to be at the thing. And I think that
Yeah.
becomes more apparent. Like,
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that only kind of grows as you get older. I mean, like, I did manage to play in. I qualified for and played in one pro tour, which was PT Cons, and I totally
nice.
fucking bombed and washed out.
I
And
mean,
I
yeah,
think,
that's a common story.
right, and that it was, and also that's to say that was when it was like so much easier,
Mhm.
relatively speaking, to like make it to an event of that level. That now, yeah, like I kind of hit a wall where I was like, yeah, it's just too daunting thinking about the amount of hours and energy and money I'd have to invest to even get to the point to then scrub out
Yeah.
again.
Even to get to the point where it's still a fucking variance game and you could just draw bad. That's
Yeah.
the yeah.
Draw bad, I tilt off and go rip cigarettes in the parking lot because I lost to an 18-year-old.
Yes.
Like,
Exactly. Exactly. So then when did Cube enter the mix? Like do you remember your first Cube experience or like when you started to get into cubes and what was that like? Like was it a vintage cube first?
yeah, so I
Okay.
would say like my first exposure. It's hard for me to recall if like the exact like Cube one that I played was a
Mhm.
vintage cube, but I definitely think like the broader like scope of cubes when I first ever touched a cube, was like things like vintage or legacy cubes, and then a few like especially back when I was like doing like GP grinding and shit like that. Like the cubes, like I would play. I definitely have played more than a couple like limited like flashback cubes that are trying to like evoke like they're people who are like collating their packs based on rarity, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
here's like Shadow more remastered, basically,
Yeah.
and so it was either that or like vintage or legacy cubes. But it wasn't really like a recurring thing in my life. It was more of like a rare thing. Like, oh, I like washed out of a tournament early and like someone was doing this thing, a free table, and I got in on it, or something to that effect. But I guess like the first like distinct cube memory I have from like the Philadelphia scene, um, is actually from, at this point, probably like 5 years ago now,
Mhm.
if not maybe even more, like 6, which is weird to think about. But actually, Jack, who in our scene,
Mhm.
who he has Wedding Stone and Keystone. I actually played his Commander cube
Okay.
on a few occasions, and that was really cool because like at that point it had been a number of years since I had played a cube of any kind, and Cube as a concept only continued to evolve and still does. And so that was the first time I was like, oh, this is sick. Someone has created this like draftable environment for a format that, and this was, way before Commander Masters or anything like that.
Yeah.
So the fact that it was like a draftable, multiplayer environment was just like very cool and felt very novel to me.
Yeah.
And I had a blast doing it, even though Commander has not really ever been my like continuous cup of tea. It's one of those things I'll play a game, get really pissed off, try not to think about it for a few weeks.
Yeah.
So something brackets.
Yeah, I mean, my interaction with Commander was like a bit when like EDH first started to get like widespread, and then like I very quickly realized that like I did not like playing Commander with anyone that I didn't know. Like I was never like a like I could always have friends with like beers and like 4 people just like opening a precons or taking precons and playing. I could always have fun doing that. But like,
yeah,
there is no appeal to me at all to like show up at a Magic Con with a Commander deck and make friends. Like I just like, there's no
literally like that's, and I mean like no shade to Commander players in chat or who will be watching the VOD, but it feels like absolutely psychotic to me, for me personally, imagining how like rolling up to a con and willingly signing up to sit with 3 strangers for like 2 hours.
Yeah.
Especially if it's at a con, because then I can't be drinking or smoking weed or something to make the whole experience a lot more pleasant.
Cube has breaks. Cube.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's the best. That's maybe the best part of Cube is all the little tiny breaks that are naturally built into it.
Exactly. And sometimes, you just know it's going to be a draft red day because you're going to need to take a lot of breaks.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to think of my rounds to go quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, and so that was my first exposure to Philly Cube, and then from there, it that part of my interest in Magic waned a little bit, or waxed, whatever the correct one is.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until I started working on B.O.N.G Cube, and even then, when I first started building B.O.N.G Cube, I built that to be playing like with my comp grinder friends, after we get back from an RCQ or like at an SCG con, just something to do to shoot the shit in the house, it wasn't until then that I started, re-engaging with Cube and it becoming a very deep fixation. And then shortly thereafter, I started showing up to the Cube locals and eventually brought B.O.N.G Cube, and yeah.
So before we jump into B.O.N.G Cube, which I definitely want to talk about, the last time we hung out was actually at Vertex, which was like the first Philly Cube event. So how was your time there?
It was great. I had a blast, honestly. I mean, shout out to everyone involved with organizing the event. I think it went off great. Everyone seemed really happy. And yeah, I had a blast. There were some cubes that I had been really wanting to play for a while that I got to play, which was cool. It was cool forcing a bunch of Philly people getting together and forcing ourselves to take over an entire pod of a local cube after like 3 rounds of cubing, just to like relax.
There you go.
And it was also cool to see B.O.N.G Cube fire a bunch of times and get a bunch of data from that, and seeing people have positive experiences with that.
Yeah. So what kind of like I'm curious as somebody who had a cube in the event, like what was that process like?
Honestly, and again, huge shout out to the organizers. It was totally painless. The night before the event on Friday, I didn't even do it. I proxied it through my girlfriend because I wasn't able to be in West. But yeah, I had my girlfriend just drop off the cube to them. The organizers were there to receive it, and then I stopped thinking about it for the weekend. Except for when I did try to spike my own cube because I was trying to lock top 8, because I will always be a results-oriented degen.
You'll catch no shade from that on this stream. None at all. None at all. It's a safe space for degenerate grinders.
Yeah, but yeah, I didn't really have to think about the cube at all during the event. The one time I did that was like a little spooky is that when at the Saturday morning when the first pod fired, after the draft, Greg came up to me and like pulled me aside because they were verifying people's check-ins and they were doing math with like the remainder of the cube that didn't get drafted. and it appeared that I was short. The physical cube was short one card according to Cube Cobra, which was up to date. Um, and as I'm sure we'll cover, there are a lot of relatively valuable pieces of cardboard
Yeah.
in there, and trying to like figure out which one that was. And ultimately, it was due to my own design flaw, which is that there was a lore seeker pack that was drafted, but whoever made the lore seeker pack accidentally made a 16 card pack instead of a 15 card pack. So it ended up everything being accounted for. So, and I very quickly, that whole process like was figured out within like 30 minutes of me being told about it. So, and I also wasn't that pressed about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the nice part, is that as a curator who had a cube in the event, I really got to like not really think about it and just enjoy the event and play and kind of shut that side of my brain off, which was great.
Yeah. So what kind of data did you get back? Like, does it come from Cube Cobra directly to you? Like, how does it like, what is that like, the feedback process?
So, so with the software that was being used for the event, which Hedron Network, that's right.
Yep.
When the event, whenever you finish drafting, you're supposed to submit a picture of your entire draft pool, and then when you're done playing, you submit another picture of your entire draft pool, so they can verify that all of the cards are supposed to that are supposed to be there are there. But then there was also an optional one to post a picture of your deck list, and then like very shortly after the event, like I think like maybe less than a week, we got sent a Google Doc that was broken, like it was folders broken down by the day and then the pod, and then within that there are folders of the different cubes with just the deck list dumps and their records.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
so and what's cool, and like shout out to like both the local community and everyone who came to the event, every single person in every single pod submitted a deck list, even though that part was optional.
Yeah.
Which was great, I'm sure that other curators who had cubes in the event could agree that, like, yeah, it was huge just being able to see all of that raw data, because out of locals, you ask people to take a deck picture, and most of the time, many people do, but like I'm guilty of this, where I like drafted something I thought was really cool, and I took a picture, and then I fucking forgot to post it.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it was just all of this bulk aggregate all at once, was awesome, and it gave me a lot of both that and talking to people who played in the cube.
Yeah.
Gave me a lot of really valuable insights that then went on to inform some cuts that I made and some additions. Yeah, it was great.
Now I'm like curious. I'm trying to remember what I drafted in the B.O.N.G cube for that event, because I did get into it, but I forget. Something with red in it, most likely.
Makes sense.
No,
I mean, red's good in the cube.
Yeah. No, I think I had Comet, so I was definitely doing. Yeah, I think I had dog. Comet fourth, so I was doing things.
Oh, okay.
I was doing
Gross.
things. Yeah. So, I guess that's a pretty natural transition into the B.O.N.G cube. So, I'm gonna switch the layout here, and hopefully we don't break. Did I? All right. So let me see what camera's on here. All right. So I've got the B.O.N.G cube up on Cube Cobra, but I think first, like, what does B.O.N.G stand for? And like, what about it? Like, why the name other than the obvious entendre, and like what is the basis for like starting the cube, I guess.
Sure. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I would say that 99% of the name is for the entendre, to the point that while B.O.N.G is an acronym, it is technically a backronym, in that I decided on B.O.N.G cube first, and I created an acronym to fit the name.
That works.
But I do think, yeah, and despite committing too hard to the bit, I do think that it is still pretty reflective of the goals of my cube from like a design perspective. In the abbreviation, yeah. I think that the abbreviation itself, I think, speaks to a certain attitude that I approach to cube construction, and also just like magic in general. which is that it's just not that serious. It's not that deep.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, so BONG stands for bombs, oddballs, near misses, and game breakers. Um, and I think that kind of can, in a very, very broad sense, that kind of establishes like 4 buckets that any card in the cube, um, except for maybe some lands, but even then, that's like a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But I think those like are 4 broad buckets that any given card in the cube could be put into. And I think in actuality, depending on the context, almost any card in the cube could probably fit into multiple of those buckets, right? But yeah, I mean, like going over those bombs are like whether it is a card that made a huge splash and constructed, whether it is a very powerful like limited bomb in its intended limited environment. They're just like powerful cards that are oftentimes like ultimately like the glue of a deck rather than like the star. I think that that's often more reserved for the game breakers category. O is, oddballs. That's like, those are just like weird cards, right? Like that's where we get into some of like the test cards or un cards, or even just black bordered cards from, standard legal sets that were just kind of weird. Like Medallion Merchant is kind of my, it's just like a weird one. Like it's not anything special. It's a 2-mana 1/2 that loots, on ETB. And it's just
I love
like,
the art.
Yeah, and I actually almost all of the art on Cube Cobra reflects the actual printing in the cube, and that foil from Odyssey I opened.
Nice.
Like fresh out of a pack. And that's part of why it's in there. And I think that the card itself on face is not necessarily an oddball, but in this environment where, you could open some very powerful cards, you see a Medallion Merchant, you're like, why is this here?
It survives Bowmasters.
Survives Bowmasters, importantly, and it is a piece of discard if you're going with like the blue-black reanimator strategy, right?
For sure. I just want to say, by the way, if we weren't friends with Juan, I could maybe give you shit about committing to a cube name bit, but like, I don't.
He kind of sets the like the platonic ideal standard for like bit cube names. So yes. I really have no shame about it.
Yeah.
But so near misses, that's kind of a lot of the cards that are in the oddballs category, I think can fit in the near misses, where the card design feels like it had some potentiality for like elegance or being like a really kind of emergent piece of design. But there's something about it, whether it's cost, a restriction, like a rider, that kind of prevents it from like hitting that point. I think that a lot of those cards can still be very, very good. They just kind of need the right environment, the right application, and like the right approach to deck building. And most of those cards I consider to be, cards like Medallion Merchant or like Sorin's Ransom. This was a card that was, when the Lord of the Rings set came out, was in the Moto Vintage Cube very, very briefly, because like ultimately it's like a 3-mana pseudo factor fiction effect that like you see it's like 3 mana, you see the effect and you're like, okay, this is like, and it's in a color pair that like wants to do that type of thing. But ultimately, whether it was like in the limited environment itself or if people were trying it out in Brews and Constructed, it didn't quite get there. And like ultimately I think it was in the Moto Vintage Cube for like maybe like a single iteration. And but I really like the card, and I think that I in general I'm really attracted to cards that like I think that oftentimes people, especially when you're talking about Vintage Cube, or just like competitive 60 card constructed deck building, like you're trying to look for like the most optimal use of resources, the most like you want the most aggressively costed, broken things. And I kind of like forcing people who still have access to a lot of those to have to then not think about it through that context because they have to play with what they've drafted, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and then finally, Game Breaker is the shortest one. Like these are just like fucked up, not okay cards that have either been banned in one or more formats or have been called for bans. Cards that make people salty, tilt off, want to quit Magic, etc.
Yeah.
You know,
Look
our
at how
fourth
cool
like,
the art is, though, on this puppy. Like, it's so good. It's
yeah,
like-
yeah. The common color pup art is sick, and that's like part of why it's still there. And I think I don't know. I fucking like a Planeswalker that the activation is rolling a die. That's just fucking funny to me.
yeah, that's great.
And so yeah, it's like shit like that. Bowmasters, you know, Guide of Souls, New Ajani.
You got yeah, okay, Palace Jailer, so you have Monarch. Other Monarch cards? Or is it just the Jailer?
So yes, I mean technically it's important to note that fourth Aerolingus.
Oh yeah, it is. It is a Monarch card. It is very important to note.
Already fucked up. And then also Aragorn, King of Gondor.
Okay.
Which its main effect of playability is that it is 4 mana, give you the Monarch, and you also get a 4/4 body.
Yeah.
But also it like makes creatures not be able to block if you're the Monarch, which is like cool.
Yeah, that's actually pretty bonkers. I think these cards have so much text. It's a lot.
I mean, it is a commander-ass card from the Lord of the product, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So how long have you been working on the cube? Like, how long has the B.O.N.G cube been like in development?
Not actually that long in the grand scheme of things, especially in the context of like my, I don't know, time with Magic. Like 2 years.
Okay.
If that, you know. It's developed very quickly, and it's like very quickly taken over my life where like I think about B.O.N.G cube a lot.
So how often do you update it then? Like, do you update it with each set, or do you like? Because I mean, they're releasing a lot of Magic cards these days. So
yeah, they absolutely are. So I mean, because I am at like, I mean, professionally by trade, while I'm not currently doing it, I'm an engineer. So I take that approach to my cube design, in that like I'm kind of always, often needlessly tinkering. And so at this point, like, I also currently work at an LGS, so it's kind of impossible for me to not look at card spoilers and be like aware of stuff that's coming out.
yeah.
And so with every set release that isn't like a reprint set, I usually find like anywhere from like 1 to, I think at the most like 7 cards from the set that I want to try out. Oftentimes, like I'm someone who I'm like very rapidly prototyping and iterative with my cube design. So like I might like from Duskmourn. Duskmourn I think is one of the sets I've added the highest density of cards off the bat. Like I think I was at like 12. No, more than 12, probably more like 14, because I tried out all 5 Overlords and all 5 of the Enduring Cycle all at once, and then some other cards. But then less than a month later, I'm now down to, I can use Cube Cobra's sorting method or filter method to actually check this.
If you can navigate their syntax, which I'm sure you can, it's pretty easy.
Okay, I'm actually still kind of at a lot. I think it was maybe more like 20 cards that I tried out. I'm at 11 right now. And I actually do think like 2 of these are probably going to get cut in this next round of updates. But yeah, so I'm always trying out stuff, even when I'm not like quickly trying things out for sets. Like I'm often just messing around with different archetypes and different packages, to the point where I probably, outside of new sets, I probably do something related to changing my cube like every 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, that must be why it's so much fun to play, because it's handled with care.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, like, as somebody who has a cube that delves into some uncards, as well as at least past iterations. I don't know if it's still in here, but conspiracies. Like, where do you draw the line, and how do you evaluate like some of Magic's edge cases that like their only real home is kind of vintage cube environments or wacky pet decks, but like where do you draw the line, or how do you think about those things in making the cut?
For me, like there are fewer lines, or there are less lines than there aren't. I don't know how I'm trying to phrase that, but there aren't that many lines for me. Like I'm pretty willing to try out anything as long as it meets like certain requirements as far as like applicability in a vintage cube environment. I think like the only stuff I'm not really interested in introducing in my cube are things that like affect accessibility as in regards to like dexterity stuff, you know, like that card from Unfinity that makes you stack stuff on your head, and it's an approach of the second sun effect. I don't fucking know.
Yeah,
but I'm not, that card's also just like not good in this environment.
Yeah, that's fair.
But
no arm wrestling card from the original,
right?
Unglued.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For me, the most dexterity that'll come in my cube is like rolling dice.
Now, do you consider an orb? Like, is that not? Would you not consider that in the cube because of dexterity? Flipping a chaos orb.
Yeah, especially because even though it like mechanically speaking, it's like you're dropping a card. You've probably seen, you know, some people.
I've shaken, like I've had like hands shaking, like with like 6 people around me and like trying to like concentrate. It's terrifying. Right. So I get it. And I'm just asking your opinion. Yeah.
There are also people who are just like objectively cracked at like flipping an orb. Like,
oh yeah, you just got.
like,
it's just reps.
Type it, you know. And so outside of that, like nothing for me feels like particularly off limits. I'm also trying not to like do things that involve like sub games, or you know, there's some test card that's like a phone a friend thing where like you turn your cell phone into a game piece. Like outside of stuff like that, I'm really willing to try anything. I will say, post Vertex, there are now officially no more conspiracies in my cube. Sovereign's Realm was simply too fucked up.
Yeah.
And I learned that from data. I mean, I knew that it was already on like my watch list, but Vertex kind of really hammered that home when every pod except for the last pod that I was in, that someone took Sovereign's Realm, they 3-0'd.
Was it undrafted in some of the pods?
I think some pods it was. No, actually, I think it did manage to show up in every pod. In fact, I think he might have won. I think the guy that won Vertex, the first cube he played on day one was B.O.N.G, and he won. He 3-0'd with a Sovereign's Realm deck.
Nice.
Yeah,
it's strong.
So it's strong, and I really like conspiracies conceptually, but I think that once people catch on to like how broken it is, it's just kind of inevitable that it becomes too powerful, because it just radically recontextualizes how you're like playing the game, and that does take some time. Like Sovereign's Realm was in the cube for like 8 months with no issues. It was a card that you would get last pick, you know.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until someone in our locals 3-0'd it once with Sovereign's Realm and Fast Bond. Everyone caught on that this card is fucked up, not okay, and it quickly became a first pickable card.
The first time I did Bong Cube, I think Prosser 3-0'd with it and didn't have the Fast Bond and just like played a degenerate Sovereign's Realm deck.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I think only 1 or 2 people have actually pulled off the like Sovereign's Realm Fast Bond combo, because like for those who are not aware, Sovereign's Realm is a conspiracy that says your hand size is reduced to 5. Once per turn, you can exile a card from your hand to be able to play lands from outside the game this turn, and your basic lands from outside the game, and your basic lands tap for any color. But notably, the clause on the exile effect says once per turn you may exile a card from your hand if you do, you may play lands, basic lands from outside the game this turn. And so what that means is if you have fast spawned out, for one card in your hand, you can play as many lands as you have life.
I think your video froze, just real quick.
Oh.
I pulled it off the stream, but I just wanted to, if you could restart it.
That good? Am I?
Yeah,
back?
all good. All right, cool.
Cool.
Awesome.
Did the audio cut out or?
No, audio is fine.
Okay,
no
cool.
worries.
But that's why I liked it in that cube, because I thought that interaction was really interesting. That it was basically a 2-card build your own channel, you know?
Yeah.
Except it's a channel for any color of mana, which is cool and strong. But yeah, once people caught on, it was too broken, and now there are no more conspiracies. So I guess that's another line, is that I'm probably not going to do conspiracies again. But when it comes to like uncards, I think they're really interesting and cool. Same goes for test cards. Like I love Jack in the Mox. In fact, my Jack in the Mox is currently on the way to Chicago to get signed by Dan Frazier. That's how much I'm in love with that card.
That's awesome. That's a great signature to get on any of his cards.
Yeah. Shout out to Jay in chat, who is doing that for me.
Jay's an all-time MVP.
Yeah, absolutely. Love them. But yeah, so there's not really too many lines for me.
So
I'm really down to try whatever, you know?
Yeah. So I know, intentionally you have a vintage cube with no power here, clearly.
Right.
So like, what was the thought of having no power? And then what is the thought with some power-esque cards like Soul Ring and Jack in the Mox, which some would say fill that function a little bit?
They absolutely do. I think I say my cube is unpowered because like that is a definition that most people understand. But as like, especially people who think about cube and especially vintage cube, like in actuality, the power in Magic is like a 20 card list where like the bottom third of that kind of rotates over time, you know? Yeah. But when it comes to the power 9 specifically, for me, and I think that an important piece of context is that like when I'm building this cube as like a vintage cube, I think it's important to note I am not thinking about like, oh, here's my take on the Moto vintage cube, you know?
For sure.
What I'm thinking about is kind of what I think like the originally intended like definitional meaning of vintage cube is, which is that I'm trying to build a limited environment wherein the decks play out in a way that feels emblematic of a lot of decks that have existed in constructed vintages history. And to a little bit of a lesser extent, also legacy. But I think because a lot of the focus is on vintage decks, vintage cube feels appropriate. And with those decks, you look at any given vintage deck list outside of some very weird few niche exceptions, like, and every deck basically plays, you know, the requisite, you know, 5 Moxen, Black Lotus, Time Walk, right? Yeah. And so for me, it's like, okay, so if we're thinking about like a historical look at vintage decks and like vintage play patterns, like the point of commonality is that almost every deck has those cards. And so, and whenever you play a vintage cube, if you ever pass, you know, a Mox or a Lotus or a Time Walk or a Soul Ring, almost always it is the wrong decision. You have done something wrong. You have made like the least like beneficial decision that you could in that moment. Yeah. And I'm interested in reducing that so then we can see kind of more cleanly constructed decks that are kind of emblematic of this like experience I'm trying to evoke. And I think that like some of the cards like Jack in the Mox, or recently right before Vertex added Mirrored Lotus, which is a test card from Mystery Booster 2, which literally makes you a Black Lotus with the downside that it makes your opponent a Black Lotus too. Those cards are just kind of funny to me. Yeah. And I want to see like, they are cards with built-in downsides, and I want to see like what weird stuff people can do despite that. But then when it comes to like the other powerful cards, like I want there to be some things that feel kind of evocative of Vintage in that way. You know, not every deck in Vintage plays a Soul Ring or Mana Crypt or, you know, those other lower tiers of power. And so it's cool to see them kind of pop up, but we can kind of remove the baseline assumption of like, oh, when I sit down to play Vintage against someone, I expect to see at least Moxen.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me play devil's advocate for a little bit though. Like what would you like, how many cards in your cube do you think are first pickable over an Ancestral Recall if you felt froggy and put just a recall in the B.O.N.G cube? Like I would pick a Soul Ring over a recall, I think. Almost every time.
Are we talking like pack one, pick one?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think that it's absolutely almost always here. If I'm thinking about this as a spike, it is 1,000% almost always Ancestral Recall, depending on what else is in the pack. Because you got to think about your wheel, right? I think that like if you're not seeing a lot of other blue or complementary colors to blue cards in that pack, then maybe you take the Soul Ring, right? I also think they're like, if you're seeing it's a very creature heavy pack, you know, with a mana cost that kind of benefits getting aggressively played out. But when I'm not thinking about this as a spike, I will say that Clown Car is absolutely first pickable over Ancestral Recall. And
fair enough.
I would do it every time. But I will also say that because I'm always testing and trying new things out in the cube, I'm currently working on an update to the cube where for some amount of time, probably not more than 2 or 3 months, the cube will be powered.
Ah, that's a fun experiment.
Yeah, and it's mostly because like there are definitely like a handful of cards that like I'm not really seeing these cards, you know, show up in decks in a way that's impactful. But I would like to, and I'd like to figure out if that's something that they're even capable of. And so the idea is then if I turn the power dial up even harder, I think what I'll see is either these cards that seemed like they weren't quite making the cut now are totally serviceable cards. That tells me that there is more I can do in my environment unpowered to help support that. If those cards continue to be absolute trash, that is a sign that I maybe need to consider cutting them and moving away from the kind of signposts that are broadly associated with those cards, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. So like to pull back a little bit, like when you I was going to ask about like the goals you have for your players, but I think we both kind of touched about like just like generally a good time. But like, do you have any other specific goals other than like, I want people to have fun?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really important for me, like I want people to feel challenged. Like as I'm sure many people can attest, there is not outside of like if you pack one, pick one, a Sovereign's Realm, there is no like on rails experience for drafting my cube, and that's like intentional. You know, there are 3 cards in the cube that impact the draft in some way, or things I have done about how I've designed the cube. Like I want the draft to be complex. I want it to be challenging. I want that to exist as its own puzzle to be solved. Especially when you're playing it with like people in your local community who have played the cube a bunch of times and they like know what to look out for. The draft becomes even harder. And I really like that. I think it can feel really rewarding to navigate that, whether you succeed or fail. I think it can be a really rewarding experience for a Magic player to like navigate that. And I think that's also really important to me because I think that's the path to having fun, is realizing that it's all just like a puzzle.
Yeah, no, that resonates very much with me. I think that's like just trying to focus things into a puzzle makes things way more appealing.
Sorry, I think you're losing audio there.
Oh, sorry. I was moving my face away from the microphone like an idiot.
No, yeah, that's better.
What's the best piece of feedback you've gotten on the B.O.N.G cube, or what, like, I guess like, and it doesn't have to be good feedback. Like what was the best or most useful feedback that you've gotten from a player or just from yourself playing? Like,
I mean, I honestly, not to continue to like commit to the bit, but I do think like one of the best pieces of advice or feedback I've gotten about the cube is the hordes of people telling me that Sovereign's Realm is not okay. Because I do genuinely think it really helps kind of hone the cube in and make it do more of what my intended goals are. I think outside of that, like, not really about any specific card or like thing to change about the design. But because I'm always talking so fucking much about my cube, just like at people, it's been really nice and has felt it's felt like a sign that I'm doing something like correct within my own goals to hear people after a draft echo assertions or comments I've made about the state of the cube. You know, noticing that like certain archetypes seem like they've gotten much stronger and not even in a negative way. Or that, you know, a card is too strong or that something feels like too weak and that they are hoping that more support comes for those types of cards. It's always really helpful to hear when these assertions that I've a rove at, often due to like a lot of intense thinking of and looking at the data, are validated. It's just like a really rewarding thing, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Last question is specifically about B.O.N.G before we move over to just like general cube design stuff. But when you look at the upcoming sets, I know there's a bunch of hype right now around the Final Fantasy stuff, but I think we got Tarkir Dragonstorm before that. And I think there's another actual Magic set, I think after Final Fantasy maybe, or before.
Yeah, it's a cool Magic set, but it takes place in space.
Space, yeah. There you go. So they're going to bring the Space Jace in. That's going to be his triumphant return.
Space Jace is cracked.
Yeah. So are there any of those sets particularly that you're excited for cards, or just going to wait and see?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a wait and see. In some ways, I'm never excited because it's just like I will have to look at the cards and think about them, and I can't not think about them through the context of my cube.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I have like a huge amount of love for like Tarkir as a setting and as like a mechanical space for cards. So I'm so excited to see that. I know literally nothing about Final Fantasy, so I couldn't feel less of nothing about the Final Fantasy stuff. But of the spoilers we've seen, there are cards where it's like, whether it's in B.O.N.G Cube or this other cube project I'm talking about, or I've been working on, called Hitachi, which maybe we'll get into. Like, there are a few cards where I'm like, hey, I'll try those, you know?
I definitely want to ask you about that cube. It's probably the best cube name I've ever heard of. So that's like, it's peak. Sure. It's peak.
Yeah, we'll get into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a thing I'm very excited for, even though it recently got pushed back a quarter because of an unannounced Universes Beyond set that at this point I'm like 99% sure is going to be Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm really excited for the return of the Lorwyn.
Yeah, Lorwyn was awesome.
Lorwyn, like the art of Lorwyn and like the setting and the cards themselves, just like really, really stick in my head. They're some of my favorite pieces of Magic art. And so I'm really excited to see what is hopefully a really nice approach to going back to that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Couple questions specifically about the actual like physical B.O.N.G cube. So I know we talked a little bit about like the printings that you have, and most of them on Cube Cobra are up to date, but like, what do you have any particularities about like the cards that are in the cube? Do you prefer like first printings? Do you prefer like art first? Is it like foils, non-foils? Like where's your head at there?
So I am, in a lot of ways, but especially in my like Magic card choice, I'm like a maximalist. In some ways, from like a critique of capitalism perspective, I think that all of the art treatments and secret layers, I think all of that's like, it's fucking ridiculous and insane. But also, if it's going to exist, I'm going to lean into it.
I endorse that. I tell everybody to get a battle bus for their cube.
There's a battle bus in my cube.
I know. I love it.
But for me, like, I love foils. I think at this point, probably, I wonder if this works. I'm seeing if I can filter by
Foil.
Yeah, so like literally half, at least half, and some of these I might be missing a few, but half of the cards in my cube are foil. And most of the time they are full arts or alt arts or secret layers. But also I have some original printing foils, and straight original printings in there too. For me, like the B.O.N.G cube is one part like magic and limited design, and one other full part like an aesthetic art project, where
Yeah.
I want to try and exhibit as many different ways a magic card can look as possible, because I think it's like really interesting that, like, especially for me when I started playing Magic, kind of peak retro border era, which was sick.
Yeah. Yeah. 7th edition foils are still the very most
They go
beautiful
so
thing.
crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want cards that are both like, original retro foils, but also the most gaudy, impossible to read secret layer. I want those to exist in the same place. And I really try intentionally to maximize the variety of that.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
And
it's
that,
also reflective. I love shiny cardboard.
There you go. Yeah. It's great to look at. I somebody who dabbles both in Magic and Pokemon. I like the Pokemon foils more, but I think Magic is starting to catch up with like the wacky treatments and shit, which makes me happy.
Right.
As far as like sleeves and like box, like, do you have anything particular? Just like a normal long card box? What's the B.O.N.G cube riding around in?
It's like currently in a teal-ish archive.
Okay.
Previously it was in a different random cube box that I have, that now the like parts of Hitachi that exist are in, but it's an archive right now. It's in the Dragon Shield Anniversary Edition sleeves that are like dark shimmery blue on the back and then silver on the inside, which is fine.
Yeah.
I wanted to re-sleeve them for Vertex, and I just picked those. And the
Double sleeve or
inners
single?
are
Okay, doubled.
absolutely double sleeved. I mean, like, I've got like a signed LED in there and
Yeah.
stuff, so it's absolutely, especially since we got a clumsy bunch in our crew.
That's true.
Myself included. And we play at bars sometimes. But yeah, double sleeved, and right now I do use the Dragon Shield diaper sleeves, the ones that you have to like tuck in.
Yeah.
However, those are not my preferred sleeves. When I have the like time and energy to do it, they will be replaced with KMC Perfect Hard inners and Katana outers.
Okay.
Because it's just the best feeling shuffle in the entire world, and that's the combination I was using on my comp decks for a while, and it's ideal for me.
All right. Last physical cube question: do you have a tokens box? Do you give a shit about tokens? How do you manage? You got all kinds of shit in your cube. You got the Monarch. You got the rings tempting us. You got everything going on here.
Yeah, I do. I don't have a Ring Temps You token because it literally doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's valid.
So, I mean, I guess there's a world where you could somehow flash back Sorum's Ranson to trigger the Ring Temps You again, but it's never come up. I do care a lot about tokens. I think there is a certain onerous on a cube designer who has a cube that produces a lot of tokens and is bringing it to environments that aren't just like your closest friends in your house, when you're bringing these out to like, cube nights, and it's seeing play by a lot of different people. I think it's important to do what you can to provide some sort of solution there, whether it's, dry erase tokens or the actual tokens themselves. I do think it's important, so I try to do it. In fact, I try to go above and beyond. I'm still missing a couple tokens for the cube, but I do keep all the tokens in a binder, alphabetized and fully alphabetized, not just first letter.
That's impressive. That's yeah. At least they're easy to find, because that's usually my biggest gripe is like people have tokens and then they're just like So, all right, well, I need like 5 elementals. All right, there's
Yeah.
one, maybe another one. Who knows? So
Yeah. I like it because it's an excuse to kind of further bling out the cube. I mean, like all of my basics are like also weird arts and printings and foils, but like my tokens, I try to pick up the foil versions when I can. I have like weird stuff like Russian food and clue tokens, weird shit
yeah,
like that. So
that's
it's just another excuse to make the cube more extra than it already is.
that's awesome. Um, so when you have an idea like the Bong Cube or Hitachi, like how long does that brew in your head before you're like, okay, like it's time for me to actually start collecting or pulling the cards from my collection or like making a Cube Cobra Link? Like, what is the incubation process for an idea?
I think it depends on how quickly I get really fixated on it, right? Because like Bong Cube was one where it was like, huh, it'd be funny to have a cube called Bong Cube. What would I want that to look like? To starting to either source cards or pull cards out of my collection. That process, that turnaround was like 2 weeks before I like started building, if that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it wasn't playable for probably like a month or a month and a half. But then there are several links on my Cube Cobra page where I have thought of a funny name for a cube or an interesting concept where I make the Cube Cobra link and maybe add some cards to it. But then I really stopped thinking about it for at this point ever.
I have a lot more dead cubes on my Cube Cobra page than actual functioning cubes, so I also get that.
Yeah, thankfully currently right now I think I'm at exactly 50-50, which is good, I guess.
That's way better than my ratio.
But with Hitachi Cube, I've known for like 2 months or so that I
Mhm.
wanted to build a cube that was different from Bong Cube, like maybe a little bit more, you know, lower powered.
Mhm.
And then I thought of the name Hitachi for the cube like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, not usually
Um,
something I associate with low power. So like,
we'll get into, um, but so even though I was like theory crafting the cube already and like writing down cards in like a note on my phone, once I thought of the name, that kind of like poured gasoline on it to the
Mhm.
point where that was like maybe 2.5 weeks ago, and at this point, like I have probably 70% of the cube together. It'll probably be done in like 2 weeks, if that. So
Nice.
it really depends on how quickly I fixate, and that
Yeah.
often has to do with a really good name.
Well, it's a great name. So like, what kind of like are you thinking about like legacy? Like, what are have you given yourself any design restrictions or is it truly vibes? Like,
At this point, it's totally vibes. For a minute when I was first theory crafting this cube, I didn't want it to be like time period restricted. I wanted it to more just be like I originally envisioned this cube as like no supplemental products, only cards that were printed in a at one point standard legal set,
mhm.
or an extended set, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and then it was also going to be like original printings, no foils. Um, However, that now has radically shifted to the point where there are supplemental product cards in it, but they're not like needlessly complex cards. Um, there are cards like uh, I think it's Boomyard Scrapper from Fallout, which is a card that
Mhm.
is in both. I think it's in Pawns of the Steppes and it's in Jack's Keystone Cube. Um, so it's nothing like super broken. Like I'm not putting like broken ass like Modern Horizons 2 or 3 cards in there.
Yeah.
But there are like a bunch of foils and um
So
it probably be as intentional of like a foil project as Bond Cube has been, but
yeah, but it's gonna end up being
yeah.
aesthetics. Yeah.
And then yeah, as far as like where it's at now, it's kind of like I want it to be like I want the cards to be pretty efficient. I want things to like feel pretty snappy. But I want it like there's no real combos. Like it's really just all vibes. It's cards I think are interesting, cards I like, cards that I thought would maybe be cool in the bomb queue because I want to play with them, but they're not actually that strong.
Mhm.
Um, And then just like shit I really fuck with and like birthing pod, you know.
Yeah. God, I hate that card. Ugh.
I
It never has clicked for me. I know it's like people love it or they hate it,
yeah,
and I don't have the brain power to like think through a pod chain.
you don't need to think through the pod chain though. That's the beauty of birthing pod is that it's actually brain dead pod. Like you take it, you know you're gonna 0-3, maybe 1-2, and you're gonna have a fucking fun time because instead of swinging with your creatures, you're just gonna pass through your combat step, and then in your second main phase, you're gonna crack it to get some other stupid bullshit that you're not gonna attack with next turn because you want to make sure it lives to crack it to pod. You
There you
know.
go. Yeah. I just I guess the fact that I definitely have never won with it, so that's probably why it's not appealing to me.
And that's the beauty of it. You can't be a degen grinder if you force birthing pod.
That's
It's the
fair.
beauty of it. But yeah, it's just kind of be kind of like shit I think is cool. And we'll see like where the power band finally settles. You know, I want it to be. I definitely like a big thing for me is I want it to be a cube that like vintage cube, and we'll get into the vintage cube slander I'm sure at some point. Like, but ultimately, like at the end of the day, there are people who just like vintage cube is not their thing.
Mhm.
Part of what's intrinsic to a vintage cube is there's not really an easy on ramp. It is by definition going to be like more complex and require like it does like require knowing some trivia checks
Mhm.
and you know having some offhand knowledge about how like one broken card interacts with another. And that's just not for some people, and that
Yeah.
includes people in our local group, and that's like totally okay. But for me, I like want to hang out and interact with those people more, and I do when I like go to a cube night playing like someone else's cube that isn't a vintage cube, and I
Mhm.
always feel great when I do that too. But like I want to also have a cube that I can provide for those
Yeah.
types of interactions and provide a space that like you're still doing fun, like cool, efficient stuff, but um I think the on ramp will be like more approachable to people who like the type of Magic and Limited they like playing is closer to that of like a retail Limited, which is sick. And I want to also be able to curate an experience around that.
Yeah. I think those are all great goals. I can't wait to try to play it at a local whenever I can get my ass to Philadelphia on a weeknight. But we are starting to do weekend ones more, which is
Yeah,
good.
yeah, those are great. I hope we continue to do this because yeah, there are
Yeah.
some people who it's just hard for them to get out into one of the game stores on a weeknight.
Yeah. So how do you think about color balancing and like, I know Bong has 65 of each of the five colors and then like 60 colorless and multicolored and lands, but like are you trying to go flat again with Hitachi, or is it going to be like you going to allow yourself more flexibility, or is that just a line that like allows you to work with it more sanely?
So I do think Hitachi. I don't know if it'll be perfect, but I do think Hitachi will be relatively color balanced. But I think that means something different between those two cubes, right? Like the bomb cube is a 540 card cube, which means even with an 8 pod, there is a significant chunk of the cube that does not get drafted. And I don't color collate my packs.
Mm-hmm.
That just sounds like too much work for something that ultimately I think is kind of a negligible difference, even if signals get a little harder to read. It's just not how I'm interested in cubing when I'm providing the cube and doing the pack making and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do think that right now the fact that Bong Cube is balanced across the colors, that's kind of just incidental. Like I try not to let one color be like significantly dominant, but there have been times where there's like, I don't know, 78 blue cards in the cube and not that many in the other colors. There have been times where I have more gold cards than I currently do. There have been times
Mm-hmm.
where I've had much less. It just kind of grows and fluctuates to with like what I'm trying to do with that cube at the time. And so right now it is just kind of incidental that happens to be relatively color balanced. That is not always the case. It probably won't be the case in 2 months. But I think for Hitachi, like Hitachi is going to be 360 card cube. So like an 8 pod drafts the entire cube. And so for that reason, even though I'm still not going to color collate the packs, I do want there to be like a relative balance, even if there's like a delta of like anywhere from 1 to 3 cards of numeric difference between two colors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair. Let's see here. So I guess we could just jump. I mean, we kind of joked around. We had a Discord discussion with some of the other folks in the Philly Discord about I think it was a couple episodes ago and now, of a Lucky Paper where they were talking about like the things wrong about Vintage Cube. And I think in the Discord, you and I were probably two of maybe the only people that advocated for Vintage Cube not sucking.
Yeah, and Jack too. Jack
yeah.
held out as a fellow Vintage Cube curator.
Yeah, but I think I as someone else who I think is in the minority on this one, which is weird. I thought, I don't know. I think it's different, but I think you hit on a lot of the points of like the on-ramp for a Vintage Cube, like, is just, it's a barrier that is rough for some people.
Yeah.
And I get that.
Yeah.
I think we all get that. I think most sane people that like Vintage Cube understand that it's like not the most approachable format. And on top of it, because I think personally for me, like a lot of pauper or peasant cubes are very unapproachable formats for me. Like I got to read all the cards. I got to understand, like, I don't know what these cards are.
Like,
and, but I think that those are, while they might require a lot of reading, comprehension, is looking at cards I've never seen before, I'm not going to get punished as hard as I would in a Vintage Cube for not knowing those things or not knowing the cards.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think ultimately, like, there is like a cognitive hill you need to like cross when you approach any cube for the first time, right? Regardless of like whether it's a peasant or a pauper or a Vintage Cube. And ultimately, I think while those descriptors are helpful for kind of, quantifying what experience your cube is going to have, those ultimately are just kind of like vague labels, right? And like ultimately any cube that is created by a singular person, as opposed to like an entire play design team, is going to have like an on-ramp that, that person either isn't thinking about as much or doesn't really care, not in a negative way, because like it's the cube they built, you know?
I think a lot of that though, like my main rebuttal or defense is that I think that some of the complaints were generally just about like bad cube design. And like, I think that affects like any cube, whether it's like, it's more, again, I will concede that I think it's more punishing in a Vintage Cube.
Yeah.
But like, I still think like, you could have a peasant cube of standard that was just like commons and uncommons in standard. And if it's not well designed or like thoughtful in how it's put together, like it's not going to be good. Like,
right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was my like main issue, and I love the like Lucky Paper crew and I love the podcast, but I think my main issue with like the take from that episode was this like implication that because of the nature of Vintage Cube, there is like an inherent less elegance in the approach to design, like I think something that was said over and over was the fact that like Vintage, like this just kind of like blanket statement of Vintage Cube is an environment where you are only thinking about the most powerful cards in Magic and nothing else. When in reality, that's just not true.
That's the Vintage Moto Cube.
That's the Vintage Moto Cube. And even then, like as they said, like that approach I think is changing.
For sure.
Some ways I think not for the better, but like I think there's still like some issues with the approaches they're taking to the Moto Vintage Cube. But like using my own Vintage Cube as an example, right? Like if we were only and before I get into that, if we were only thinking about most powerful cards in Magic, full stop, then every Vintage Cube would also run the Time Vault package. Because that is objectively, in like a data-driven sense, like the highest win rate deck in Vintage Cubes. It has no color restrictions. It's very easy to piece together. But despite that, most Vintage Cubes don't, because it is very powerful, but it creates these like parasitic patterns that lead to like feel bads.
I like Aqua's cube take on it, which is just put like a Kiora in there and take out the voltaic key. Leave the time vault. Make you do other weird, slower things to untap it.
Right, yeah. And I think, and like using my cube as an example, like of the pitch elemental cycle from MH2, I specifically don't include Fury and Grief. I've tried them out before, but I don't include them because while those cards are very powerful, like people who play my cube who have a background in constructed, most of them have like such feel bad feelings associated with those cards because of the havoc they wreaked on formats that they are now banned in, you know? I also don't include the initiative, which is another, like, objectively, if we're thinking about the most powerful card, that includes like cards like White Plume Adventurer, Seasoned Dungeoneer, Caves of Chaos Adventurer, cards like that.
Yep.
I specifically don't include those because I think they are too powerful. That said, I also think because it's not just only thinking about the most powerful cards, there are vintage cubes that are very elegantly designed that run cards like Grief and Fury and the Initiative with no issue. I think like the Wedding Stone by Jack is another example of that because his vintage cube has power. It has, you know, a lot of the broken cards I have, but also has all the initiative cards. It has Fury and Grief. But it's not like, but when you play that cube, it doesn't really feel bad because also Jack's designed the cube in such a way where there is a shit ton of interaction to deal with cards like that, including things like breaking Singleton for extra copies of Force of Will and Force of Negation and Swords, you know? And so it's not always just focused on only putting the most powerful cards together.
Yeah.
Because like ultimately you want people to have fun, and if you're only concerned with that, people are inevitably not going. Some amount of people are inevitably not going to have fun.
For sure, I'd say most people are not going to have fun. I think
absolutely.
So we've been going for like an hour and 15 minutes. So there's going to be a couple questions that I wanted to ask you that I'm not going to get to, unfortunately. But I do.
Okay.
Before we wrap up, I do want to ask, like, what are your thoughts on? And this is kind of like a vague question, but I still think it's worth asking. Like, what are your thoughts on the future of Cube, and like as you see like the direction Magic is going as a whole? And I think that's like a rabbit hole to go down potentially with like the prices of the Final Fantasy set that even shocked me. And
crazy.
But like, where do you see Cube going? Where would you like to see it?
Well, I think that like I really like the direction I've seen like Cube going, even just from like the proximity of looking at our local scene over like the last, I don't know, year and a half that I've been like hanging out with everyone. And even just seeing what people are talking about on the internet about Cube. I think it's really cool that like in the way that Cube has existed as this kind of counter force to the like money grind of Wizards of the Coast, you know, and how they are approaching, you know, Magic product design. Cube has always felt like it's existed as like a counter to that. I like that in light of all of these announcements about Universes Beyond and the like constant cycle of new product coming out, more and more people are building like vibes cubes, you know, or cubes that are evoking a certain era of Magic. I think those are really cool. I have a lot of fun when I play those cubes. I love playing Twilight as an example of that. And seeing more of those and more people's take on like what was an era of Magic or what's a design constraint on your limited environment that makes you feel really good about the game in current reality where a lot of people are feeling a level of like disenfranchisement from the game. Also, I really love seeing the like uptick in clown shoes, like cubes that are fucking with the rules of Magic, you know, like a cube I was really excited to play at Vertex and got to was the companion cube, which such a cool way to think about a cube, and I had a blast doing it, and I companioned Nadu, even if that wasn't necessarily the best decision. I did do one though.
There you go.
I love that bird. That was a mistake I'm glad Wizards made. They made it for me.
That's a cool bird.
But yeah, those are two directions that I really like seeing more and more pop up in various cube scenes.
Yeah.
And also, like, I really want vintage cube to keep being a thing. I think it's a really fun and cool way to approach Magic, but especially limited, because it's not really something you get to experience in a retail limited setting. And I want people to keep thinking about vintage cube and how to continue to make it feel fun and fresh, without just the constant cognitive overload of, you know, hundreds and hundreds more new cards being printed every year. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. You're awesome. Thank you so much for the time, Juniper. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for those in the chat. We're going to wrap it up now, but I appreciate it. Go out, draft Cube, play Magic, and if you can't afford Magic cards, print them out.
Print them out.
That's what I'd say about that.
Yeah. Proxy it up. See ya.
Peace.
Love before.